Hello, welcome to the next video in the Cumulus Cycles JavaScript tutorial series where we'll discuss functions. A function is a container for a block of code written to perform a specific task. When we need to execute the code in the function, we invoke the function by calling it, using the name of the function. For example, here's a simple JavaScript function. We start by using the function keyword to tell JavaScript that we want to create a function. Then we give the function a name, and in our case, the name is greetUser. Then we have the opening and closing parentheses, followed by the opening and closing curly braces. If we execute these two statements in the browser, we'll see that the console.log of the greetUser function is indeed a function, and its type is function. The code that we want to execute when we invoke the function is contained within the opening and closing curly braces. So here I've added code to declare a variable named greeting with the text hello world, and then we use a JavaScript alert to display the greeting. If we save this code and reload the page, nothing happens because we've only declared the greetUser function. We haven't yet invoked it. To invoke the function, we reference the function by name and then add the opening and closing parentheses. If we save this and then go back to the browser and reload the page, now we see our JavaScript alert with the greeting hello world. Now, in addition to simply executing the code inside the function, we can pass values into the function when we invoke it. These values are called parameters, and they're defined inside of the opening and closing parentheses. Here I've added a parameter named username. Then inside of the function's code, we could reference the value of the username parameter by referring to the parameter by name. And to pass the value when we invoke the function, we include it in the parentheses of the function call. So now, when I invoke the greetUser function, I pass the string foobar. The greetUser function is invoked. The username parameter has a value of foobar. So we'll set the value of the greeting to the string hello and then inject the username's value, which is foobar, and then issue the JavaScript alert. So if we look at this in a browser, now we have our greeting using the value of the parameter we passed in when we invoked the function. We can also test to see if we actually passed a value into the function when we called it, and then handle the case where no value was passed in appropriately. For example, if we invoke the current version of our function without passing a value, this is what happens. Hello, undefined. So to fix this, we could add the following conditional in the function to test if the value of the username passed in is undefined, or if the username parameter wasn't actually passed. So let's comment this out, save the code, and go back to the browser. And if we run this now, we write to the console, hello world. Because we called the getUser function, we didn't pass a parameter. So when the function is invoked, we set the greeting to an empty string. Then we check to see if the username, which was the parameter, is equal to undefined, which in this case it is because we didn't pass the value in. Then we'll set greeting to hello world and then console.log it. If we uncomment the function call to greetUser and pass the string in, now we see hello foobar, which is the value that we passed in as the parameter. We can also pass multiple parameters into a function. So here I've modified the getUser function declaration to take two parameters, an fname and an lname. And then inside of the function code, I check to see if the fname is undefined. And if it is, I'll print the greeting hello world. If the fname is not undefined, that means we passed the first name in. Then we'll check to see if the last name is not undefined. And if that's true, that means we also have a last name. And in that case, the greeting will be hello first name, last name. If the first name is not undefined and the last name is undefined, then we're just going to print hello first name. So let's save this and test our logic. So first we'll call the function with no parameter, and we see hello world, which is what we would expect. Now let's just pass a first name, and we see hello foo. And finally, we'll pass a first name and a last name, and we see hello foobar. Now, in addition to passing values into a function via parameters, functions can also return values. In fact, unless you explicitly return a value, the function will return an undefined value. For example, say we have a function named calcsum, which calculates the sum of two numbers passed in as parameters. If we create a variable named sum and set it equal to the value of calling the calc sum function and passing the parameters 1 and 2, when we execute the function, it will calculate the sum and then return. And since we don't have an explicit return statement in the function, the value it returns will be undefined. So if we console.log 1 plus 2 equals and then the value of the sum variable, we should see 1 plus 2 equals undefined. So let's go ahead and save this, run it in the browser, and we see 1 plus 2 is undefined because we didn't explicitly return a value from the function. Now, if we call calc sum and return the calculated sum, when we print console.log, we should see 1 plus 2 equals 3, which was the sum which was calculated in the calc sum function and returned. And as a shortcut, because we're not actually doing anything with the sum once we calculate it, other than returning it, we could just calculate it and return it in one line. So let's just test to make sure we still see the same result, which we do. Now let's take what we learned about arrays and looping in the prior video and incorporate that into this function example. So here we have a function named calc_av, and it takes a parameter named numbers. Down below, we've declared a constant with a name of numbers, and we set it equal to an array with 5 values. Then we have a variable named average, which is equal to the result of calling the calc_average function passing the array of numbers. Inside of the calc_average function, we declare a variable named sum and set it equal to 0, and then we're looping through the numbers array. Each time through, we sum plus equals the value in the numbers array at the ith index, with I starting at 0. So this for loop is going to loop through all these numbers each time through, getting the current value and adding it to the sum. Then after we've calculated the sum, we'll divide it by numbers.length and round that to 2 decimal places and return it, and that value will be stored in the average variable. And then we can write the average to the console. The last example I'd like to look at in this video is a self-invoking function. And a self-invoking function is a function which can be executed without being called. Function expressions will execute automatically if the expression is followed by open and close parentheses. You have to add the parentheses around the function to indicate that it's a self-invoking function. This function that we have here is actually an anonymous self-invoking function. It's a function without a name. You recall in the prior examples we used the function keyword to tell JavaScript we wanted to create a function, and then we named the function. Here, we're wrapping the entire function inside of open and close parentheses. We're declaring that we would like to have a function, and it's followed by open and close parentheses. And then the body of the function is in the open and close curly braces. So that's the anonymous function declaration. Since it's followed by the open and close parentheses, that's how this anonymous function becomes self-executing. So if we look at this in the console, we see that when the page is loaded, the text, the self-invoking function is about to be invoked, is written out. So that's our first console.log statement. Then we see the self-invoking function is executing, and finally, the self-invoking function has been invoked. And nowhere in our code did we give the function a name and then explicitly invoke it. All right, so I know that I had just said that that was the last example I wanted to look at in this video, but there is one more topic that we need to cover related to functions, and that's to show you an example of a function calling another function and then passing a return value back to the originator of the initial function call. So just stick with me for a second. So in our code, we've declared a function called calc_sum, which takes 2 arguments. We also have a function named process, which takes no arguments, and then a variable named sum, which is equal to the result of calling the process function. And then ultimately, we'll write out to the console the sum is whatever has been calculated. So initial processing starts off by calling the process function, and if we look in there, we'll see that we declare a variable named sum and set it equal to 0. And then we have variables for n1 and n2. And those are going to be the 2 numbers that we want to calculate the sum of. Now, I'm going to populate the n1 and n2 variables by using a JavaScript prompt and asking the user to enter the first and second numbers. And I'll default them to 0 in case the user just clicks OK and doesn't enter a value. So let's jump over to the browser and reload the page, and we'll see what these prompts look like. So here's the first one. Please enter the first number. So I'll enter a 10. Click OK. For the second number, I'll enter 40. Click OK. And we see the sum is 50. So jumping back into the code, we now know how we've populated N1 and N2. So now I want to set sum equal to the result of calling the calc sum function and passing the N1 and N2 values. Now, when the user enters those values, even though they're entering a number, they're actually being given back to us as strings. So what we need to do is take the N1 and N2 string values the user provided and pass them into the parse int method, which will convert them from the string, in my case, the string 10 into the number 10, and the string 40 into the number 40. And after we do those parsings, that's what we pass to the calc sum function. Inside of the calc sum function, we just compute the sum and then return it. And as we saw in a prior example, because we're not going to do anything with the sum, we could just return the result of calculating the sum. Now, we've gotten in the values from the user, we've parsed them into integers, we've passed them into calc sum. Calc sum has done the math and returned the value. That's put into the sum variable, and then that is returned as a result of calling process and stored in this sum. And actually, we could come up here and just return the result of calling the calc sum function. Now, if we save this and run it again, we'll still see the same result. So this time we'll put in 100 and 400, and we see the sum is 500. So this is an example of calling a function, getting values from the user, parsing those from strings to ints, and passing them into another function, which does the math, returns that value, which is ultimately returned back to the variable, and then we write it out to the console. So in this video, we saw an overview of functions in JavaScript. In the next video, we'll take a deeper dive into functions, and I think you're going to like the demo. I hope to see you there.